charge. Writing, nothing would be more fatal than for the government of states to get into the hands of the experts. Expert knowledge is limited knowledge, and the unlimited ignorance of the plain man who knows only what hurts is a safer guide than any vigorous direction of a specialized character. Why should you assume that all except doctors, engineers, etc. are drones or worse? If the ruler is to be an expert in anything, he should be an expert in everything, and that is plainly impossible. If the ruler is to be an expert in anything, he should be an expert in everything, and that is plainly impossible. It was an argument for practical judgment. And boy, does that argument resonate more than a century later after the last 2 years of deference to experts and the absence of so much practical judgment by those policymakers in office and the experts that they have deferred to. For more on the topic, we're pleased to be joined by Arthur Herman. He's a historian and a Pulitzer Prize finalist, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and New York Times bestselling author, most recently of The Viking Heart, How Scandinavians Conquered the World. Scandinavians are perhaps leading the world in practical judgment over the last 2 years with the Swedish, Danish, Finnish approach to these matters related to COVID. Arthur Herman, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, yeah, speaking of Scandinavia, to the extent that they were closed, they're all moving on and learning to live with COVID. They've been doing that for a long time in the schools, but now they're doing it formally across the board for all aspects of life in those countries. But here, we're still tethered to our experts, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. And boy, that quotation from Churchill really resonates, doesn't it? I mean, when you think about what has happened and the kinds of people we've had, Robert Fauci really stands out, but he's not the only one, who have dictated American public health policy over the last 2 years. And it turns out that not only were they wrong, but they also may have done, in some cases, irreparable harm to our kids, to the generation who's had to suffer with the loss of education, of social experience, of jobs, of economic opportunity, thanks to COVID mandates and lockdowns and all the other policies that were imposed. And so here's what's so surprising, Dan, or maybe it's not, is that even as they were realizing that these people, number one, didn't really know how to deal with this pandemic, and number two, that so many of their policy recommendations turned out to be wrong and that were actually making matters worse, they didn't change course. There was never an adjustment. And it's that mindset, it's that kind of elite expert mindset that my Wall Street Journal piece was saying is now going to be on trial in our political system, first in the 2022 midterms and then in the 2024 presidential election as well. And that's why I'm predicting, and this is what the piece in the Wall Street Journal yesterday is about, on Monday, what it's really about is predicting that we're going to see a major political realignment as a result.
Yeah, it's you sort of get to it in your own vernacular. The way I describe what has been revealed to people who perhaps weren't paying as close of attention as they should have been, lo these many decades as the Leviathan expanded in our lives, is the political class does not view its constituents as sort of assets, and the charge is to provide an environment in which those assets, fully realize their potential. They view people, right. They view the deplorables, the rabble, like me, as liabilities that need to be managed. And I think that has been laid bare over the last 2 years.
It really has. And of the way in which our political elite, and not just political elite, but also media elite, educational elite, scientific establishment, really see their fellow Americans not as partners, but as subordinates, who are to be ordered about, who are to be told how to live, how to organize your life, when you're allowed to open your store or restaurant, and when you're not, when you're supposed to wear a cloth mask and when you're not, even though, as that recent study coming out of Johns Hopkins University shows that the masks and lockdowns have had really no discernible effect on reducing the mortality rates from this COVID pandemic. And Dan, maybe their biggest failure, the biggest failure of all, which I don't talk about in that article, but which I think really needs to be underlined, is the degree to which they have not held to account the country that set this whole thing in motion, and that's Communist China.
Yeah, and then you look at Denmark. Yesterday they dropped all COVID restrictions, no more passports, masks, anything like that. But they also admitted that they were wrong, that they went about this wrong. And do you think we'll ever see that from any Democratic politician in America?
I think there's a very slim chance, Amy, of something like that happening. I think what we're going to see instead is, and we're seeing it now, is they really feel like they have to nail their mandate flag to the mask. And they are currently waging war on anybody who questions the mandate lockdown dogma that they've imposed on the rest of us over the last 2 years. Look what's happening with Joe Rogan. And that's a perfectly good example of where they have really doubled down now in this country, have doubled down on that desire to make sure that there's only one point of view and only one kind of policy that people
if they
are allowed to participate in.
If they deserved any empathy, you would almost be empathetic to these COVIDians because they've really put themselves in a corner in terms of offering some sort of mea culpa like the Danes did, because you have this guy who you ceded all authority to, Tony Fauci, who declared he is science. So if you were to apologize, if you were to cross this person that you've elevated, then you just descend into all sorts of finger pointing and infighting on your side of the divide here, which weakens your position that much further. The point now is to come up with a cover story or just pay no attention to the wreckage that is left behind you and push forward, declare victory at some point, and try and focus people's attention forward rather than in holding them to account for what has transpired over the last couple of years.
That's right. And circling the wagons around a figure like Anthony Fauci, that he can do no wrong and has done no wrong. And as you say, push forward. And what I fear, what they're pushing forward towards now is to bring about the same kinds of regulations and mandates with regard to climate and imposing a Green New Deal in the same way that will have a direct effect on how people conduct their lives day to day, of what they're allowed to, where they're allowed to go, when their businesses and schools are allowed to be open, and what's going to happen there.
So
and of course, one of the great things, Amy, that's really come out of this, isn't it, is the degree to which, because of the failure of the schools to do their job and the teachers' unions, is that parents have had an opportunity now, the schools closed, to really understand what it is their kids are learning in school. And so you had this massive pushback on that front as well, thanks to COVID. We live in Loudoun County, which is ground zero of this parent pushback against school boards and teachers' unions on this front. And that, too, is also going to be contributing to the political realignment that's going to happen in 22 and 2024 as politicians and other institutions are held accountable for the mistakes and for the gross incompetence that they've shown on this and in other areas, from crime to schools, you name it. The progressive model of governance is failing before our eyes.
So do you think COVID shutdowns is just a dress rehearsal for climate change shutdowns?
I think you've already seen that, and you've seen that in places like Michigan with Governor Whitmer, for example, of the degree to which many of the restrictions, for example, regard to recreational vehicles, exceptions were given for electric vehicles versus gas-powered vehicles. Little tiny things like that. But yeah, this is a dress rehearsal and in their minds has been a dress rehearsal. Now I think though people come to understand that the very same people who gave you uh, misinformation and lied to you about what was happening in COVID, what would work with COVID, may also be lying to you when it comes to issues like climate change, and maybe lying to you about a range of other things that advance the progressive cause, but are actually very harmful to American security and to Americans' future.
Yeah, I mean, on the climate change, look at California and Gavin Newsom, banning all gas-powered vehicles by 2035 or whatever the date pulled out of his hat is at the moment. But I'm more worried, actually, there's an intermediate step, and they're going to do with flu what they did with COVID, so as to say, well, look, see, we're treating this all under the same sort of public health threat, because, if they can do to the kids what they've done under COVID, well, they would have the argument to do the same under the flu, since it's more deadly for kids under the age of 18.
Yeah, I mean, why not? I mean, it opens up the pretext for a whole range of mandates regarding, under the rubric of public health and under the rubric of protecting our kids, that simply increases government's power and supervision over other people's lives. And we mustn't forget this too, and the Joe Rogan case, I think, is exemplary, is that with this also comes not just that you must comply with our policies, but you can't complain about it, or you can't at all suggest there's an alternative. I think a really good definition of a totalitarian government, totalitarian society, like Communist China, like Cuba, like North Korea, like the old Soviet Union, is that freedom is redefined as freedom to agree with the consensus. Mm-hmm. And that's what we've seen the media and social media impose through this COVID crisis. And the examples are legion. I don't have to supply you with any, or your listeners.
Going back
again, I think what we're going to see is going to be a significant pushback on that kind of thought control and speech control that is also going to enter into the political equation and the political earthquake that I predict is going to happen.
Yeah, you going back to the midterms, that's where I wanted to go. You compare 2022, at least to some extent, to the 1932 election 90 years ago.
Right.
Elaborate on that comparison, where you think it's similar.
Well, I mean, what I suggested was that we have an analogous historical situation, that just as the Great Depression and that experience, that searing experience that affected the lives of nearly every American, of the ineptitude and failure of big business and Wall Street to protect America from economic catastrophe. Just as that experience caused Americans across the country to turn to the political party that promised that it could offer solutions via expanding government power through expanding federal supervision over what happened in the individual states, that just as that turn to the Democrats triggered a political realignment, starting in 1932 with the election of Franklin Roosevelt, and the Democrats taking almost 100 seats in the House of Representatives and 12 Senate seats, that triggered a national realignment starting in 1932 that lasted for really 2 generations of trust in big government, trust in the power of the federal government to do good and to bring good things and to protect the interests of ordinary citizens. What's happened now, I think, and it's been coming for a while, hasn't it? I mean, the Trump election in 2016 was a sign that the elites were in trouble. You could even go back to the Tea Party as an example, that the elites were in trouble. But with COVID, I think now this has been a failure that touches the lives of every single American, just as the Great Depression did. And these lockdowns and mandates, what I call in my Wall Street Journal piece, the Great Confinement, that this Great Confinement has likewise caused Americans to lose trust in big government, in the promise that progressive makes about the way in which government betters our lives and protects our interests. And then what we've seen instead is that big government on the progressive model actually destroys lives, turns our streets into dangerous war zones, and turns our schools into ideological factories for a Marxist leftist agenda. And but we'll see. We're already seeing it. We got a harbinger of this in our elections here in Virginia in November, and in New Jersey, where the Democrat government barely squeaked through when Republicans shouldn't even had a chance at upsetting the election. That we're going to see a similar sweep beginning, not in the same numbers. No one is saying the Republicans are going to take 100 seats in the House of Representatives or anything like that. But what we're going to see is the building of a political wave, of a political realignment, as political scientists say, that could well spill over for a generation plus.
Yeah,
and I think we're already seeing that underway.
Yeah, I agree with that. And as much focuses on Youngkin and his slate's victory in Virginia as the canary in the coal mine, I think Edward Durr beating that state Senate president in New Jersey is even a bigger one. And if Republicans can get
even more, that's a really good point.
If Republicans can get out of their own way in D.C., maybe you could see those sort of numbers like you saw for Democrats in 32. We'll see. Arthur Herman, Pulitzer Prize finalist. He's a historian, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, New York Times bestselling author, most recently of The Viking Heart, How Scandinavians Conquered the World. Arthur Herman, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's been a great pleasure. Talk to you guys soon.
Yeah, thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You're listening to Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
When you order your Walgreens prescriptions with same-day delivery, it's possible you'll experience some side effects. Side effects may include joy that you won't run out of your pills and disbelief at just how crazy fast the delivery came right to your door. Get your same-day prescription refill today on the Walgreens app.
To use same-day Rx delivery or 1 to 2 business day delivery, you must be opted into prescription status alerts. It will appear as